Madonna Mia. I'll never forget the morning of May 13th, 1943, when I first smelled real coffee brewing in an American military kitchen. The aroma drifted across the dusty compound at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, mixing with the scent of bacon frying and fresh bread baking, while Bing Crosby's voice floated from a radio somewhere singing White Christmas. The Alabama sun was already warming the wooden barracks, and mockingbirds were singing in the pine trees like they were welcoming us to paradise instead of prison. I was Sergeant Major Giuseppe Nonna Benedetti, 132nd Armored Division Ariete, Italian Army, and after 18 months fighting alongside the Afrika Korps in the deserts of Tunisia and Libya, I thought I knew everything about hunger, about surviving on scraps, about what it meant to be truly desperate for a decent meal. My nickname Nonna came from my ability to make something edible out of nothing. Dried pasta, a few olives, maybe some cheese if we were lucky, the kind of simple cooking my grandmother had taught me back in Napoli. But what I experienced over the next 2 years and 4 months in that Alabama prison camp would change everything I thought I knew about America, about abundance, and about what it meant to be treated with dignity, even as a prisoner of war. I would gain 35 pounds eating better food than I'd ever had in my life, including delicacies that even wealthy Italians couldn't afford during wartime. My journey to that Alabama kitchen began on May 7, 1943, during the final collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia. I was commanding a platoon of M13-40 tanks near Bizerte, trying to hold back Montgomery's 8th Army, while the remnants of the Afrika Korps retreated toward the coast. The morning was already scorching hot, typical for North Africa in May, with the desert wind carrying sand that got into everything: our food, our water, our ammunition, our souls. We'd been fighting a losing battle for weeks, running low on fuel, ammunition, and hope. Our M13-40 tanks were no match for British Shermans and Churchills, and we all knew the end was coming. Italian morale had collapsed after the disaster at El Alamein, and most of my men were more concerned with surviving than with fighting for Mussolini's African empire. The end came at 0847 hours when a squadron of British Crusader tanks appeared over a ridge to our east, while American Shermans attacked from the west. We were caught in a perfect crossfire with no escape route and no reinforcements coming. I ordered my men to abandon their vehicles and fight as infantry, but within 20 minutes, we were surrounded by Allied forces that seemed to materialize from the desert itself. "Arrendetevi! Surrender!" shouted a British captain who spoke decent Italian, his voice echoing across the rocky ground. "The war is over for you." I looked around at my platoon, 28 men, most of them barely out of their teens, all of them exhausted, hungry, and ready to go home to their families. Continuing to fight would have been suicide for no military purpose. "Basta," I said, using the Italian word that meant enough. I raised my hands above my head, and my men followed suit. The war was over for the 122nd Armored Division Ariete. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare of prisoner processing, medical examinations, and transportation that took us from the deserts of North Africa to a staging camp in Morocco, then to England aboard a converted cargo ship that smelled like diesel fuel and unwashed humanity. The British treated us correctly according to Geneva Convention standards. We received adequate food and medical care, but we were constantly reminded that we were prisoners, enemies, defeated soldiers whose country had chosen the wrong side in this war. The real shock came when we were transferred to American custody at a port facility near Liverpool. The first American soldier I met was Corporal Danny O'Sullivan from Boston, a cheerful Irish-American kid who spoke to us in broken Italian he'd learned from his neighborhood back home. "Buongiorno, paisanos," he said, with a grin that showed perfect white teeth. "Welcome to the American Expeditionary Force. You boys ready for some real chow?" I had no idea what chow meant, but his friendly attitude was completely different from what I'd expected. The German propaganda we'd been fed constantly claimed that Americans tortured their prisoners, that they were savage barbarians who showed no mercy to captured enemies. Instead, Corporal O'Sullivan handed each of us a package containing cigarettes, chocolate bars, chewing gum, and something called K-rations that turned out to be complete meals in small cans. The chocolate alone was better than anything I'd tasted in 2 years of military service. "Where are you taking us?" I asked in my limited English. "Alabama, Sarge," O'Sullivan replied, using the American abbreviation for my rank. "Camp Aliceville. Gonna put you boys to work. But don't worry, we feed our workers good. Real good. The journey to America took 2 weeks aboard the Liberty ship SS Alexander Hamilton, and every day of that voyage challenged my assumptions about American treatment of prisoners. We were housed in converted cargo holds that had been fitted with bunks, but we received 3 hot meals per day, medical attention for anyone who needed it, and even recreational activities including movies shown on deck in the evenings. But it was the food that first revealed the magnitude of American abundance. Breakfast included real eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with sugar and cream, and sometimes pancakes with syrup. Lunch featured soup, sandwiches made with actual meat, fruit, and milk. Dinner offered roasted chicken or beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and desserts that seemed impossibly luxurious for a prison ship. "Madonna," whispered Antonio Rossi, a tank driver from Milano who'd been captured with my unit. "They feed prisoners better than officers eat in the Italian army." He wasn't exaggerating. During my entire military service, I'd never consistently eaten as well as we ate during that transport voyage to America. And according to the American guards, this was standard prisoner rations, nothing special or extraordinary. When we arrived at the port of Mobile, Alabama on May 10, 1943, the first thing that struck me was the abundance visible everywhere. The docks were crowded with cargo ships, the warehouses were bursting with supplies, and American workers moved with the confident efficiency of people who'd never known real scarcity. But more shocking was the countryside during our train journey from Mobile to Aliceville. Through the windows, I could see farms that looked incredibly prosperous compared to anything in wartime Europe. Cattle grazed in green pastures, crops grew in perfectly maintained fields, and farmhouses looked well maintained and comfortable. "Look at those barns," observed Marco Fierro, a mechanic from Torino. "They're bigger than most houses in Italy. And look, every farm has automobiles, sometimes 2 or 3. It was true. Even in rural Alabama, prosperity was visible everywhere we looked. These people weren't just surviving wartime rationing, they were thriving despite having sons and husbands fighting overseas. Camp Aliceville itself was a revelation. Instead of the harsh prison compound I'd expected, we found a well-organized community of wooden barracks, recreational facilities, workshops, and a central mess hall that could seat 800 prisoners at once. The camp was surrounded by wire fence, but it felt more like a military base than a prison. Our camp commander was Colonel Robert McKenzie, a career Army officer from Tennessee, who addressed us during orientation with a combination of firmness and respect that I'd never experienced from superior officers in the Italian army. "Gentlemen," he said in careful English, speaking through an interpreter, "you are now prisoners of war under protection of the United States Army. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, which means adequate housing, medical care, recreational opportunities, and 3 nutritious meals per day." He paused, studying our faces with the expression of a man who understood exactly what we were thinking. "I know what you've been told about American treatment of prisoners. Over the next few months, you'll have the opportunity to judge for yourselves whether those stories were accurate." My first meal at Camp Aliceville was on the evening of May 13, 1943, and it changed my understanding of American capabilities forever. The mess hall was arranged with long wooden tables that could seat 8 men each, and the serving line was operated by American cooks who treated us with professional courtesy rather than hostility. The menu that night included roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, dinner rolls with butter, coffee, and apple pie for dessert. Apple pie, something I'd heard about but never tasted, made with enough sugar and butter to feed a family for a week back in wartime Italy. But the real shock came when I saw the portions. The American cooks were serving enough food for 2 men on each plate, and when I gestured that it was too much, Sergeant Williams from Georgia just laughed. "Son, you're skinnier than a fence post," he said through the interpreter. "Eat up. We got plenty more where that came from. Plenty more." Those words would define my entire experience at Camp Aliceville. America didn't just have enough food for its prisoners, it had abundant food, luxurious food, food that was prepared with care and served with dignity. Over the following days and weeks, I began to understand that this wasn't special treatment or propaganda designed to impress prisoners. This was simply how Americans ate, even during wartime, even when feeding enemy soldiers. Breakfast typically included eggs, bacon, or sausage, toast, oatmeal, coffee, and orange juice. Real orange juice, not the watered-down substitute we'd drunk in Italy. Lunch featured soup, sandwiches, fruit, milk, and cookies. Dinner offered roasted meats, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and desserts that rotated between cake, pie, ice cream, and puddings. But the real revelation came on Sunday, May 23, 1943, when the camp kitchen served what they called Italian Night, an attempt to provide familiar food for the large number of Italian prisoners. I was working in the kitchen by then, having volunteered for cooking duty because of my nickname Nonna, and my reputation for making something edible out of limited ingredients. When Sergeant Williams told me they wanted to serve spaghetti and meatballs, I laughed out loud. "Sergeant," I said in my broken English, "you cannot make real Italian food with American ingredients. It's not possible." "Well, Nonna," he replied, using my nickname with a grin, "why don't you show us what real Italian cooking looks like?" What followed was the most surprising cooking experience of my life. The American commissary had ingredients that I hadn't seen since before the war began. Real beef for meatballs, real tomatoes for sauce, real cheese for grating, real olive oil for cooking. They had garlic, onions, herbs, and spices that most Italian restaurants couldn't afford during wartime rationing. But more than that, they had quantities that seemed impossible. When I asked for 10 pounds of ground beef to make meatballs for 400 prisoners, Sergeant Williams just nodded and had the meat delivered from the camp's refrigeration facility. When I needed 5 gallons of tomato sauce, they opened cans without counting the cost. When I wanted real Parmesan cheese for grating, they produced wheels of cheese that would have cost a month's wages in Italy. The Italian night dinner was a success beyond anything I could have imagined. 800 prisoners received plates of spaghetti and meatballs that tasted better than what most of them had eaten at home, accompanied by salad, bread, and wine. Actual wine, not the harsh spirits we'd occasionally received in the Italian army. After dinner, prisoners were talking excitedly about the meal, but their comments revealed something deeper than appreciation for good food. "Giuseppe," said Antonio Rossi, "that meal used more meat than my family ate in a month before the war. How do Americans have so much food that they can feed prisoners like kings?" It was a question that would haunt me throughout my time at Aliceville. How did a nation that was fighting a global war on 2 fronts, that was supplying allies around the world, that was maintaining massive military forces overseas, how did such a nation have enough abundance to feed enemy prisoners better than those prisoners had eaten as free men in their own country? The answer became clear over the following months as I worked in the camp kitchen and observed American food distribution, preparation, and consumption. The United States wasn't just wealthy, it was wealthy beyond anything Europeans could comprehend. Every morning, supply trucks would arrive at Camp Aliceville loaded with fresh meat, vegetables, dairy products, and canned goods. The quantities were staggering: hundreds of pounds of beef, pork, and chicken, crates of fresh eggs, gallons of milk, sacks of flour, sugar, and coffee, cases of canned fruits and vegetables. But what amazed me most was the waste. American abundance was so great that food was sometimes discarded not because it was spoiled, but because it was approaching its expiration date and might become less than perfectly fresh. Bread that was 2 days old would be fed to livestock. Milk that was near its expiration would be poured out and replaced with fresher supplies. "Sergeant Williams," I asked one day, "in Italy, we would eat this bread for a week. Why do you throw it away?" Williams looked at the day-old bread I was holding and shrugged. "Nonna, we got fresh bread coming in tomorrow. Why feed the boys stale bread when we can give them fresh?" It was a philosophy that applied to everything in the camp. Why serve leftover meat when fresh meat was available? Why reuse coffee grounds when new coffee cost pennies? Why ration butter when the commissary had unlimited supplies? This abundance extended beyond basic necessities to genuine luxuries that I'd never experienced even as a civilian. Ice cream was served regularly, not as a special treat, but as a normal part of meals. Fresh fruit was available year-round, imported from California and Florida when local crops weren't in season. Steaks were served on special occasions. Actual steaks, thick cuts of beef that represented more protein than most Italians ate in a week. But the real transformation in my understanding came when I started receiving letters from home in late 1943. My wife Maria wrote from Napoli, describing food shortages that had become desperate. Bread was rationed to 150 grams per person per day, about 5 ounces. Meat was virtually impossible to obtain. Coffee was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and even then it was made from roasted grain rather than coffee beans. Meanwhile, at Camp Aliceville, I was eating steak twice a week, drinking real coffee with every meal, and consuming more calories per day than I'd ever consumed as a free man. The contrast was so stark that I initially thought Maria was exaggerating the situation in Italy to make me feel sorry for the family. But when other prisoners received similar letters from all over Italy, a pattern emerged that revealed the true scope of American abundance compared to European scarcity. "Giuseppe," said Fabio Conti, a tank commander from Roma, "my brother writes that Romans are eating cats and dogs to survive. He says the only meat available is on the black market at prices that would cost a month's wages." Similar stories arrived from Milano, Torino, Venezia, and every other Italian city. The homeland was starving while American prisoners ate like aristocrats. It was a reversal of every assumption I'd held about warfare, sacrifice, and national strength. The most profound revelation came in November 1943 during American Thanksgiving, when the camp kitchen prepared a feast that exceeded anything I'd experienced in my entire life. Turkey, ham, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green beans, corn, dinner rolls, and multiple desserts, including pumpkin pie, apple pie, and ice cream. 800 Italian prisoners received a meal that would have been considered extravagant for wealthy families in peacetime Italy. And this was just one meal on one day, in one prison camp, in a country that was simultaneously feeding millions of soldiers overseas and supplying food to allied nations around the world. "Nonna," said Sergeant Williams as we cleaned up after that Thanksgiving feast, "I want to ask you something and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." I nodded, curious about what he wanted to know. "You've been here 6 months now. You've seen how we feed prisoners, how much food we have available. Based on what you've observed, what do you think this means for the war?" It was a question I'd been avoiding because the answer was too disturbing to acknowledge. If America could afford to feed prisoners this well while fighting a global war, what did that suggest about American industrial capacity, American agricultural production, American ability to sustain military operations indefinitely? "Sergeant," I said slowly, "if you have this much food for prisoners, then Italy cannot win this war. Germany cannot win this war. You are not just fighting with soldiers and weapons, you are fighting with abundance itself." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I figured you'd realize eventually. You're a smart man, Nonna, and you understand what you're seeing here." Over the following months, as 1943 turned into 1944 and the news from Europe grew worse for Axis forces, I began to understand that Camp Aliceville was more than just a prison. It was a demonstration of American power that was more effective than any propaganda. Every meal was proof that America could afford to be generous to its enemies. Every luxury was evidence that American abundance was real, not just wartime boasting. Every act of kindness showed that American strength came from prosperity, not from the desperation that was driving Axis resistance. By spring 1944, I had gained 25 pounds and was healthier than I'd been since before the war began. My uniform from the Italian army hung loose because my body had filled out from consistent nutrition. Other prisoners showed similar transformations. Men who'd been gaunt from desert warfare and poor military rations became robust and energetic from American prison food. But the physical transformation was accompanied by a psychological transformation that was even more profound. We stopped thinking of ourselves as prisoners and started thinking of ourselves as guests or students or refugees from a war that was destroying our homeland while leaving America untouched. The turning point came in June 1944 when news of the D-Day invasion reached Camp Aliceville. Instead of mourning another Allied victory, most Italian prisoners felt something approaching relief that the war might end sooner rather than later. "Giuseppe," Antonio Rossi said to me as we listened to BBC radio reports about the Normandy landings, "if the Americans can feed prisoners like us this well, imagine how much better life will be for Italians when this war is over and we're their allies instead of their enemies." He was expressing what most of us had come to believe. America represented not just military victory, but the possibility of prosperity and abundance that Europeans had never experienced. The prison camp had become a preview of what the post-war world might look like under American leadership. My work in the camp kitchen continued throughout 1944 and into 1945, and every day reinforced the lesson about American capabilities. The food deliveries never stopped, never decreased in quantity or quality. If anything, they seemed to improve as American agricultural production reached wartime peaks. Meat became more varied and higher quality. Fresh vegetables were available year-round. Dairy products included not just milk and butter, but cheese, ice cream, and cream that would have been unimaginable luxuries in wartime Europe. Coffee was not just available, but was premium quality, better than what wealthy Italians had drunk before the war. But beyond the food itself, what impressed me most was the attitude of American personnel toward prisoner welfare. They weren't just following Geneva Convention requirements, they were genuinely concerned about our health, morale, and preparation for eventual return to civilian life. Colonel Mackenzie instituted educational programs where prisoners could learn English, American history, and democratic principles. We had access to books, newspapers, and magazines that allowed us to understand American society beyond just its military capabilities. Recreation included sports, music, theater, and art programs that kept prisoners mentally engaged and emotionally stable. The medical care was particularly impressive. Any prisoner with health problems received treatment that was equivalent to what American soldiers received. Dental care was provided regularly. Even minor complaints were taken seriously and treated promptly. "Why do you treat us so well?" I asked Captain Morrison, the camp's medical officer, during one of my routine checkups. "Giuseppe," he replied, "you men aren't our enemies anymore, you're our responsibility. We want you to go home to Italy healthy in body and mind, ready to help build a better future for your country." It was an attitude that reflected American confidence in the ultimate outcome of the war and American generosity toward defeated enemies who were no longer threats. By early 1945, as news from Europe made it clear that Germany and Italy were collapsing, discussions in the camp turned to post-war possibilities. Most prisoners had decided that they wanted to return to Italy as advocates for American-style democracy and capitalism. "When I get home," said Marco Fierro, "I'm going to tell everyone what I learned about America in this prison camp. Not about American military power. They'll learn about that from the war itself. About American abundance, American generosity, American values." The liberation of Italy in spring 1945 brought mixed emotions to Camp Aliceville. We were eager to return home to our families, but we had also become comfortable with a lifestyle that was better than anything we'd known as free men. My final meal at Camp Aliceville was on September 15, 1945, exactly 2 years and 4 months after my arrival. The kitchen staff prepared a farewell dinner that included all the dishes I'd learned to cook with American ingredients: real spaghetti and meatballs, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, bread, and apple pie. As I sat in that mess hall for the last time, surrounded by friends I'd made during 2 years of shared captivity, I reflected on how completely my understanding of America had been transformed. I'd arrived expecting torture and deprivation. Instead, I'd experienced abundance and dignity that had changed my entire worldview. Sergeant Williams approached my table during that final meal, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Nonna," he said, "I want you to have something to remember us by." Inside the package was a cookbook, The Joy of Cooking by Irma Rombauer, inscribed with signatures from all the American personnel who'd worked with me in the camp kitchen. "When you get home to Italy," Williams said, "I want you to remember that good food brings people together, no matter what language they speak or what uniform they used to wear." I still have that cookbook today, 78 years later, and I used it to teach my children and grandchildren how to cook with abundance instead of scarcity, how to prepare food as an expression of love and hospitality, rather than mere survival. The journey home to Italy took 6 weeks aboard a converted troop transport, but this time I was traveling as a free man returning to a liberated country. During that voyage, I had time to process everything I'd learned during 2.5 years of American captivity. When I finally walked into my house in Napoli on October 30th, 1945, my wife Maria barely recognized me. I'd gained 35 pounds, my clothes fit properly, and my health was better than it had been since my youth. "Giuseppe," she said, touching my face with wonder, "you look like a different man. What did the Americans do to you?" "They fed me, cara mia," I replied. "They fed me like a king. But more than that, they had shown me what abundance looked like, what generosity meant, what strength really was. America hadn't defeated Italy through cruelty or oppression. They had defeated us through demonstration that their way of life was simply better than ours." Over the following months, as Italy struggled to rebuild from wartime destruction, I used the cooking techniques I'd learned at Camp Aliceville to help my community. The American Cookbook became a guide not just for preparing food, but for understanding how abundance could be created rather than simply rationed. I opened a small restaurant in 1947 using recipes and techniques learned in an American prison camp to serve food that most Italians had never tasted. But more importantly, I became an advocate for Italian-American friendship, telling everyone who would listen about the America I discovered behind barbed wire in Alabama. When people ask me about America, I would tell my customers, I don't talk about their bombs or their tanks. I talk about how they fed prisoners better than those prisoners had eaten as free men in their own country. That's the kind of strength that wins wars and builds lasting peace. The restaurant was successful, but my real contribution was helping other returning prisoners adjust to civilian life with the understanding that Italy's future lay in partnership with America rather than opposition to it. Many of us became the foundation of post-war Italian democracy, bringing back not just memories of American abundance, but appreciation for American values of individual dignity, democratic governance, and economic opportunity. In 1963, I was invited to return to Alabama as part of a veteran reunion program. Camp Aliceville had been converted to other uses, but I was able to visit the site and meet with some of the American personnel who'd served there during the war. Sergeant Williams, now retired and living in Atlanta, greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered from 20 years earlier. "Nonna," he said, embracing me like an old friend. "Look at you, still cooking, I bet." We spent 3 days touring the area where the camp had been, sharing memories and reflecting on how that experience had changed both of our lives. Williams told me that working with Italian prisoners had taught him about the humanity that existed even among former enemies, and how food could be a bridge between different cultures and nations. "You know what I learned from you boys?" he asked as we stood where the camp mess hall had once served thousands of meals to Italian prisoners. "What's that, Sergeant?" "That the best way to win a war is to show your enemies that they'd rather be your friends. And the best way to do that is to treat them with dignity and feed them well." It was a lesson that America applied not just to prisoners of war, but to the entire post-war reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan was essentially the same philosophy applied on a continental scale, showing former enemies that American partnership was more beneficial than American opposition. This was the story of Sergeant Major Giuseppe "Nonna" Benedetti, 132nd Armored Division Ariete, who discovered in an American prison camp that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the capacity to share abundance. His experience, documented in camp records and confirmed by dozens of fellow prisoners, demonstrates how American generosity toward captured enemies helped lay the foundation for lasting peace and friendship between former adversaries. Benedetti's account illustrates how American treatment of prisoners of war reflected deeper values about human dignity, democratic principles, and the power of abundance to transform relationships between nations. The meals served in camps like Aliceville were more than just food. They were daily demonstrations of American values that would influence European reconstruction for generations. Giuseppe Benedetti's transformation from enemy soldier to American advocate shows how individual experiences during wartime can reshape entire nations' relationships. The cookbook he carried home from Alabama became a symbol of how American generosity could plant seeds of friendship that would bloom into lasting alliance. What struck you most about Giuseppe's story? Have you heard similar accounts from family members who experienced American generosity during or after World War II? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual acts of kindness can have profound historical consequences. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, we'll be sharing the story of Private First Class Robert Bayou LeBlanc, who served as a guard at German POW camps in Louisiana and discovered how Cajun hospitality could transform bitter enemies into lifelong friends. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.